Starwalker Studios presents Gamemaster's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. Greetings, gamer, and welcome to Gamemaster's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. Today, I'll give my first impressions of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and I'll tell you how you can run or play D&D on the cheap or even for free. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener and or player. Welcome to the 7th episode of Gamemaster's Journey. I'm Lex Starwalker, and I am transmitting this message from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside of time and space. So it's really great to be back on the show again, and today I want to talk about some Dungeons & Dragons. I was a little bit resistant, actually, to 5th edition. And I was not part of the playtest, and I was kind of prejudiced, I guess might be the word, against D&D 5th edition. I'd gotten burned by 3.5 coming out right after I'd just gotten all of the 3.0 books and came back to think about playing D&D when 4th edition was out and didn't like what I saw there, and also seemed like that was really soon after 3.5 for another edition. And then lo and behold, yet another edition. And it just really seemed, and I still hear people say this, that, you know, Wizards of the Coast is just going to churn out a new version of D&D every few years. Just about the time you get everything you need or want, you know, they're going to come out with a new edition. And if you want to be playing the latest, greatest thing, you have to start over and buy all those books again. A lot of people still feel that way, and I think for good reason. You know, buyer beware and learn from history, right? And they've had a history of doing that. I've heard, I haven't actually seen a source for this, but I've heard people say that Wizards has said that they are not going to do that with 5th edition and that they're planning for this edition to last for a long time. But I've also heard people say that they said the same thing about 4th edition. Now, it could be that they intended that with 4th edition and it did so dismally that they decided to go at it again. So maybe they are honestly intending that to be the case. And if they are, then I think chances are really good that we won't be seeing another edition. We won't be seeing 6th edition anytime soon, because unlike 4th edition, 5th edition is doing really well. It's really popular. A lot of people love it. And what's interesting to me is you look at people who love 5th edition and you ask them, you know, well, what was your D&D before 5th edition? And some of them loved 2nd edition. Some of them loved 1st edition. Some of them loved 3rd edition. Some of them loved 4th edition. Some of them loved, you know, the original D&D. And I think that's really cool. And that's, to me, a sign that Wizards has succeeded at what they were trying to do, which is to make a version of D&D to bring everybody together, to have a D&D that you can recognize no matter what, you know, your D&D version was in the past. And that's something that they really kind of screwed the pooch at with 4th edition, I think, because one of the most common comments I hear from people who didn't like 4th edition was, you know, it wasn't even D&D anymore. It was hardly recognizable as D&D other than the words Dungeons & Dragons on the covers of the books. They've tried with this edition to kind of stay more to the roots of D&D, and even, I think, avoided some things that they might have wanted to do, but they were afraid would be a little bit too far from the roots of D&D, and they really wanted something that would bring back all those players who left D&D for other games like Pathfinders and indie games and stuff. I think they've succeeded. Now, one thing that's really cool is a lot of those ideas, or probably all of those ideas that they wanted to use but didn't, are in the DMG as optional rules. I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to talk about the DMG a little bit. I might have to do a whole show on the new Dungeon Master's Guide, because it's the best Dungeon Master's Guide and the best book like it that I've seen in any game I've played or read. I'm really loving it, and it's becoming a staple. I have that book with me no matter what game I'm running. I use it when I run Numenera. It's awesome, but I'll talk more about that later. So I finally took the plunge. What I started out with, and this is what I recommend that you start out with if you haven't checked out D&D yet, is I went and got the free PDFs. There's quite a series of free PDFs you can get now on the site, and I will have this linked in the show notes. But there's the basic players rules, which has 4 classes and 4 races. So you've got human, elf, dwarf, and halfling. And in your classes, you've got the basic 4. You've got rogue, fighter, cleric, and wizard. Now, there's quite a bit more races and classes than that in the player's handbook, but the free PDF just has 4 of each, and it has your basic rules. And then there is another PDF for the Dungeon Master that's got some more stuff in it. And there's also a PDF for each of the adventure books that are out right now. So there's one for Hoard of the Dragon Queen and one for Rise of Tiamat. And if you get all of those PDFs, and they're all free, you download them, you print them out, or you put them on your tablet, or whatever you do, you will have enough there as a GM. You will have a good selection of spells and magic items and even creatures that you can run D&D for quite a while with just that, without spending anything. And presumably you've already got dice, so you can play D&D for free. You can try it out. And now, granted, your players are going to be limited to 4 classes and 4 races, but it wasn't that long ago in D&D that that's what there was. Well, I guess it was that long ago, but it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. But, that's something I'm going to talk about towards the end of the show, is playing D&D on the cheap, because one of my main criticisms of it, and I hear this from other people too, is it's so expensive to buy into D&D, because you have to buy 3 books and they're pretty salty. And actually that's not as true as I thought it was. And it really doesn't end up being more expensive than other games like, say, Numenera, but I'll talk about that more later. So one thing that's really cool for me with this new version of Dungeons & Dragons is I am finally taking the plunge and I'm building my own world. Towards the beginning of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it starts going into world building and creating your own world. And one thing that I love about this Dungeon Master's Guide is it is full of all kinds of helpful charts and tables. And so if you're creating your world and you want to create a kingdom or a city or whatever you want to create, there are all kinds of tables with ideas. How big is the city? What type of city is it? What kind of government does it have? All those things. There are tables for them listing all, the possibilities. And then of course you can roll on those if you want. And that's just awesome. Sometimes I roll, but usually I just look through the tables and pick the thing that looks cool. And it's really to help you create things, whether you're creating an NPC or you're creating a building or a town or whatever. At any point where you're kind of stuck and you're not sure what to do, you can look at one of those tables and you'll get ideas. I was reading the world building section and I was really liking what they were doing and how they kind of walk you through this process of building your own world. I never really took the plunge of completely designing my own world from scratch, and I am doing that with 5th edition. And one thing that I have decided to do is I am going to have some episodes of this podcast where I talk about world building, and I'm going to kind of take you with me as I create my D&D world, so you can kind of learn a little bit about world building. And just like with the Obsidian Monolith episodes where I'm walking you through creating a campaign, I think it's also a great way to show you how to do world building, is to show you by example. So that's what I want to do, and that's what I'm going to do. And I want to thank JM and Nick from the Iconic podcast for giving me this idea we were talking one day and I was telling them how, I'm finally making my own world. And they were like, oh, well, you should podcast about that. That would be interesting. So that's a great idea. So thanks, guys. And definitely check out Iconic Podcast. It's a great 13th Age podcast. And even if you're not into 13th Age or you don't know about 13th Age, it's still a great podcast to listen to, because they have a lot of stuff kind of like this show that's more, just general RPG stuff. And they do a lot of interviews with people in the industry, which is super cool. So one thing I wanted to talk about today is I've been running D&D 5th edition. I've been running Tyranny of Dragons. I'm actually running 2 groups through it. I'm running one online on Twitch. I'm streaming it. So you can go to twitch.tv/Starwalker Studios and you can watch it while we're streaming. We usually play every Thursday from 6:30 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then I also put those videos up later on my YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/C/Starwalker Studios. And I'll have all that linked in the show notes. So you can, if you're into watching actual plays, you can check those out. And I am also running it for some people here locally, like physical people around a physical table, which I don't do a lot of these days. The guys I'm running for here in Indiana in person, this was their first exposure to 5th edition. At this point, we've played one session. We played the first session, and most of them are pretty new to role-playing, and the only game that they've played is D&D 3.5. Now, there's at least one of them that has played other things, and he's been role-playing for quite a while. But a lot of the guys in the group, he kind of brought into it, kind of like what I used to do, and he got them playing D&D 3.5, and that's all they've ever played. And understandably, they love D&D, and that's what they want to do. I tried for a while to get them to play some Numenera with me, and I couldn't really get them to bite because they like D&D, and that's what they want to do, which is fine. Stick with what you like, right? I wasn't sure if they go for 5th edition, but when I got 5th edition, I wanted to see if they'd want to play it. So they were excited to try it. And so I went in to run D&D for these guys, and it was really interesting to see, because here was a table full of guys. They'd never played it before. This was their first time playing 5th edition, their first time making a character. They were used to 3.5. They love 3.5. So I was really curious to see, how are they going to react? Are they going to like this? Because there are a lot of similarities between 5th edition and 3.5, but then there's a lot of things that are different too. Well, right away, the reactions were extremely positive. And in fact, I don't know that I've ever seen a group of new players so excited about a game as these guys were. And it started with character creation. They were really enjoying making their characters, especially with the backgrounds. That is when people really started getting engaged and having a good time, was when it got time to pick their backgrounds. And it was kind of funny too, because I almost felt this kind of resistance when we got to the backgrounds part, and I'm like, everybody needs to pick a background, and you need to pick 2 personality traits, a bond, an ideal, a flaw. Kind of this like feeling of, oh, we don't want to do that. Let's get to the game. But then people started looking at the backgrounds, and they started looking through the tables of example traits and bonds and ideals and flaws, and they were loving it, and they were having a blast. And I remember one of the guys said something like, this game is so great, it makes your character for you. And some of them were looking through the tables and picking traits that they really liked, that they thought fit their concept, and kind of using those to enrich and deepen their concept. And then some of them, I know one guy rolled on every table, and he just had a blast with just taking whatever random thing he rolled and coming up with a concept based on these different things and how they fit together. And it was actually kind of freaky, because all of the things he rolled, like, it all fit together really well. It wasn't like he had these weird combinations that you had to be creative to explain. He ended up with traits that just like reinforced each other and fit together perfectly. And everybody really enjoyed it. And the players actually insisted, when we started, they wanted to go around the table and everyone describe all their background stuff and kind of tell the story of their character's background, which was so awesome to see, because that is something, I always try to get people to do that in any game I play, I'm like either at the beginning or when the PCs actually meet each other, I like to have this time where the players get to know each other's characters and talk about your background and your life up to this point and who are you and what happened to make you who you are. And a lot of times it's like pulling teeth to get players to do much of that at all, if they'll even do it at all. And with this, I didn't even have to suggest it. The players suggested it, and everybody had a really great time talking about their character and who they were. And none of it had to do with what kind of weapon they were carrying or what spells they knew or anything like that. It wasn't any mechanical stuff. It was all role-playing stuff. It was awesome. So I love that about the new edition. I love the backgrounds and the personality traits, the bonds, the ideals and flaws. And once you pick those things for your character, you have a really good idea of who your character is. And another game I've really been liking lately is Numenera. And, you know, I think Numenera does a really good job of kind of establishing your character, but it's much more like mechanical stuff. It's much more, oh, what are your abilities? What are the things you can do? There's really not a whole lot role-playing wise in the character creation of Numenera, at least not compared to 5th edition. And this is a huge improvement on previous editions of D&D where there wasn't really anything, at least not in the system, not in the character creation process that was like, define these things about your characters. I mean, there was alignment, your skills and your proficiencies depending on the version, and that was like it. Another thing I really love about the changes in the game is they've kind of shallowed out the power curve a bit, especially compared to 3.x. So now you have an attribute cap, which I really like. So usually your attributes can't go higher than 20. There are some magic items and artifacts and things that will let you go up to 24. But unless you have something that specifically says it'll let you go to 24 or a class ability or something, your cap is 20. And when you're creating a character, your cap is 15. And you also have a minimum of 8. So you can't dump a stat lower than 8. And you can't have a stat lower than 15 if you're using point buy or the array. Now, if you're rolling, then you get whatever you roll. I know a lot of us have these broken ways that we roll. You know, oh, you can just roll as many times as you want or whatever people do to like try to get ridiculous ability scores. And, you know, in 5th edition, I really recommend you just do point buy and or the array. They're the same, basically. Mathematically, they're the same. Because if people actually roll fairly and they don't cheat, more likely than not going to end up with scores that are not as good as the array or point buy. But if you do roll, I would really do the 4d6 keep 3 and not do anything beyond that, because this version is really tight as far as how things scale, because the power curve is a lot shallower. If you start out with an 18, well, your max is 20. So in 20 levels of character development, you're only going to be able to raise that ability by 2 points. 15 is the new 18, basically. Which was something that the players I played with in person like had a hard time with, because they had a really broken way that they would roll for ability scores in the past. And, you know, they're like, well, I'm not playing a character that doesn't have an 18. By the end of the first session, I think they realized that, oh yeah, you know, 15 is the new 18 in this version. There's also now a cap on magic items, and you no longer have magic item slots like you did in 3rd edition. We're not doing the MMO version here. Instead, you have what's called attunement. So more powerful items require you to attune with them, and you can usually only have a maximum of 3 attuned items. So it's a very elegant way of limiting how many items you can use, while at the same time you can have 3 rings if you want. You know, it's not like 3rd edition where, oh no, you can only have 2 rings, even though it doesn't make any sense why you couldn't have more. And the attunement thing actually makes sense. And kind of a side thing with that is that's also now how you identify magic items. So any character can identify a magic item by just spending an hour with it, attuning to it, and in that process they learn everything it can do. So the main benefit of something like the identify spell now is that you can just do it faster. And of course, in the DMG, there's tons of optional rules, and there's an optional rule to do it more old school where they have to research stuff and everything if you want. But I like the way the attunement works. There's also a cap now on how many buff spells you can have going. And that is using the new concentration mechanic, which is nothing like concentration in 3rd edition. Well, it is a little bit, but basically certain spells now have a duration of concentration, and you have to concentrate to keep those spells up. And like 3rd edition, if you take damage or something, you have to make a roll or lose a spell. But that's about where the similarity ends with 3rd edition. But you can only keep one concentration spell going at a time. So a lot of your more powerful buff spells are concentration spells, so you can't stack 10 buffs on everybody like you did in 3rd edition, which is great. Again, it shallows that power curve and it just limits the ridiculousness, and it makes the PCs make decisions. Instead of, I'm just going to cast every buff that will stack, it's like, no, you need to pick, what's the one buff that you want to cast and who are you going to cast it on? You have to make tactical decisions. And I also like that magic items are cool again, much more like in 2nd edition, and I think even better than they were handled in 2nd edition. 3rd edition magic items got so generic right down to how they were created, and getting a +1 magic item in 3rd edition was nothing. It was like hardly better than masterwork. Actually, there's no masterwork in 5th edition, which is fine. That only seemed like an unneeded level of complexity. But magic items are really cool now. For one thing, they're not as powerful. Again, we're having a shallower power curve. For the most part, they're limited to a +3 bonus, so there are no +4 or +5 swords. But the other cool thing is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where you have your magic items, there are also various tables you can use with any magic item, well, at least non-consumable ones. Tables for things like who created the magic item or who is the item intended to be used for. So this is something like, oh, this item was created by elves and so it's lighter than normal, or this item was created by demons so it has this property, or this item was created by a fey creature so it has this property. Another one is a detail from its history. Another table that you have is minor properties, and this can be all kinds of crazy things like butterflies flock around you to the item can never get dirty, all kinds of stuff. And then there's a table of quirks, which are just little, weird things about the item, weird magical things that it does. And for any item, you can use all of these or some of them. You can pick something from one of these tables, you can roll on the tables, or you can use the tables as inspiration to come up with your own thing. Just for fun, for one of my campaigns, I saw in the future that there was going to be a +1 longbow, right? And in like 3rd edition, +1 longbow is like the most boring thing in the world, right? But in this edition, first of all, a +1 longbow is actually pretty powerful, because even a +1 bonus in this game is meaningful. And for another thing, I gave it all this thing, so I know who made it and what it was made to do, and I know some details from its history. It has some minor properties, it has some quirks for a +1 longbow. So this longbow has the kind of development that like an artifact would have in, say, 3rd edition, and it's a +1 longbow. And I'm doing this with all my magic items. I'm coming up with more than just the base stats of what the thing is to make it interesting and cool. Another aspect of the shallower power curve is your spell save DCs now start at a base of 8 plus your modifier instead of 10. And you also just add your ability modifier. You don't add the spell level to it, which is cool. So your DCs tend to be lower than, say, 3rd edition. And your proficiency bonus also caps at +6. So your proficiency bonus is replacing your skill bonus from 3rd edition, and it's replacing your hit bonus from 3rd edition, or your THAC0 from 2nd or 1st edition. So that caps at +6, as opposed to if you were a fighter, a 20th level fighter in 3rd edition, you had a +20 bonus just from your to hit bonus. So much shallower power curve, which makes things like your +1 items much more meaningful. It lessens the drive to like have ridiculously high ability scores, because, having a 16 with a +3 is a big deal when the power curve is this shallow. And I predict that it will also greatly ease play at mid to high levels and speed it up, because you won't have such big numbers to crunch and deal with as you did in 3rd edition. I don't know that for sure because I haven't gotten there yet, but it seems very logical that that's going to be the case. And not only are the bonuses smaller, but there's less of them. You don't have situational bonuses or penalties anymore. That's done away with and is done with disadvantage and advantage instead. It's very rare that you get any kind of a modifier on a roll other than your proficiency bonus or your ability score bonus. Very rare. So another thing that I love about this edition is the Dungeon Master's Guide is awesome, as I mentioned, and it's a great supplement to use for any game you run, especially one that's at all fantasy. For instance, Numenera, which is science fantasy, the DMG works great for that. The main things I love about it for other games is the charts and tables for generating random NPCs, random buildings, random towns, random villains, random dungeons, tables. If you haven't checked this book out, check out the tables for like generating a tavern, right down to what's the name of the tavern, or generating a villain, things like what's he afraid of, or what's his weakness, or all kinds of like aspects to his personality. They have these huge tables that you can either roll on or pick something or use it as a springboard to come up with your own ideas. And it makes it very, very easy on the fly in the game to generate an NPC as detailed as you want, or a building, or whatever. I also really like the legendary and lair abilities, which are abilities that more powerful creatures get, that are basically things that they can do at the end of a PC's action. So they get their regular actions on their initiative turn, and then they can take X amount of legendary abilities per turn at the end of a PC's turn, which is super cool. And lair abilities are basically just legendary abilities that they can use when they're in their lair. And this is something awesome that I think would be fun to use in pretty much any game when you have an adversary for the PCs that is really awesome and powerful. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how you can play 5th edition on the cheap or even for free. So as I said, the basic rules PDFs for players and DMs, you can get those for free from the website, and you can get the PDFs for the Tyranny of Dragons books. And between those, you're going to have your basic rules, character creation, monsters, spells, items. And even if you're going to go all out and you want the full rule set, you really only need the player's handbook. All the basic rules of the game are in the player's handbook, and you can easily, as a GM, run D&D with just the player's handbook. The only thing you're really going to be missing is monsters, which there's basic like horse and dog and basic animals and stuff in the player's handbook, but you're going to be missing like monsters, and you're going to be missing magic items. But again, those PDFs have a lot of monsters and magic items, so if you wanted, you could just use the player's handbook and use those PDFs for your monsters. The only downside is there's no illustrations for the monsters, and the same thing with the magic items, where in the DMG, most of the magic items have illustrations, which is awesome, and the first time ever that we've had that. Obviously I think all the monsters have illustrations in the monster manual. So, it is true that ultimately to play D&D, you're going to want the player's handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the monster manual, which is 3 books as opposed to a game like Numenera where you just have it all in one book. But again, in fairness, it's kind of apples to oranges comparison, because like say Numenera, it's like, yeah, you can run Numenera with just the core book and everything you need is in there. But for instance, the creatures, there's not that many creatures in there. Nothing compared to the monster manual in D&D. So Numenera, eventually you're going to need the bestiary for Numenera, which is another book. And the same thing with the magic items of Numenera, which are called Numenera, ciphers and artifacts and oddities. Now there's a good selection of those in the core book, but especially the ciphers, players go through ciphers so much that you will start seeing them over and over again after a while. So again, you're going to need the technology compendium for Numenera, which is another book. So boom, right there, you are at 3 books, and the Numenera core book is more expensive than any of the D&D books. And the nice thing about D&D is you don't have to get them all at once. Like, you can get the player's handbook and start out with just that, and then maybe a little later get the monster manual, and then maybe a little later get the Dungeon Master's Guide. And other than the treasure tables and the magic items, the majority of the Dungeon Master's Guide is optional rules and world building stuff. And I mean, if you're going to be a serious dungeon master DM, if you're going to be a serious dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to want it because, like I said, it's got these great tables for creating NPCs and settlements and building your world and all that stuff. And you're going to want the treasure tables and stuff. But I'm just saying, you know, if you want to try the game out and you want to check it out, for one, you can do it for free. And for two, you can do it with just the player's handbook if you want more than just the free PDFs. And also, you can get all these books are like super cheap on Amazon. Like the core books are, I think, $50 cover price. And they're all $30 or less on Amazon. Some of them are 20 something. So, you know, if you're buying books for $50, you're crazy or rich. And another thing is it really does seem like this is not going to be like 3rd edition and even 4th edition. I mean, I don't know much about 4th edition, but I do know that I've seen a lot of 4th edition books out there. And, you know, so far we have the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual. We have Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, which are 2 adventure books that go together, basically an adventure path in Pathfinder terms, and the DM screen. And that's it. That's all that's come out for the game. I searched high and low, and the only products I could find on the official Wizards site for D&D in 2015 is the Princes of the Apocalypse adventure, which is coming out April 7th, and that is looks like a Temple of Elemental Evil kind of thing, although it's in Forgotten Realms, so that'll be interesting to see what they do with that. This new adventure, Princes of the Apocalypse, is going to be level 1 to 15. It's going to be 1 book for $49.95, and in addition to the adventure, which, you know, is basically the whole Tyranny of Dragons, level 1 to 15. I mean, it's not just an adventure, it's a whole campaign. It's also going to have new elemental spells, and it's going to have the element-touched Genasi, is that how you say it, as a new playable race. As part of this rollout of Princes of the Apocalypse, there's also going to be a free download PDF for that will be out in mid-March. That's going to have the new Genasi races in it, plus the other player content from the adventure. So you can actually get that stuff for free without even getting the adventure. So I will have a link to the page all about that in the show notes. And it looks like Wizards is planning to release 2 adventures / campaigns on this scale per year. And they've got them planned out, I guess, till like 2018. So no mention of splat books or anything like that in the next year. So do I think that they're not going to do anything in the next year? I really hope they do. I'd really like I said before, I'd like a book with more backgrounds and archetypes for the classes. That would be awesome. I'd love to see something like that in 2015, but they're definitely not rolling out books every month or 2 like Paizo does. 2 adventures a year, or I should say 2 campaigns a year, and that's kind of it so far. So, you know, this is definitely very different than 3rd and 4th edition, the volume of books that they're coming out. So I guess my whole point with this is the whole reasoning of, oh, it's too expensive to play D&D. It really doesn't wash. It's really not any more expensive to play than any other game. And for instance, Numenera, you can't play Numenera for free. You got to buy the book for $60. Or, you know, 50 or less on Amazon. But at least you can try it for free, which is pretty sweet and something I hope more game companies do in the future. All right, well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Gamemaster's Journey. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker. And please join the Game Masters Journey community on Google+. You can find a link to that in the show notes, or you can just head on over to Google+ and search for Game Masters Journey. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. please visit the website to check out the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. If you enjoy Gamemaster's Journey and you'd like to see it continue and keep going strong, please consider supporting the show. There are a lot of great ways you can do so. You could become a patron of the show on Patreon at patreon.com/GamemastersJourney, or there's a link in the show notes. We also have a donate button on our website if you'd like to make a one-time donation. You can also test drive Audible books with a free trial courtesy of Gamemaster's Journey. And also, if you shop on Amazon, please use the referral link for Amazon in our show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. I want to thank you so much for tuning in again to Gamemaster's Journey and for supporting the show and the studio. I really appreciate it. I'll be back at you next week, and in between, there'll be some more Obsidian Monolith goodness for you. So enjoy the week and keep gaming.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GamemastersJourney.